Let's move on to war internationally, or the potential for it. This is quite a headline from the Asia Times. John Lehman, China, Russia, Iran threaten new Pearl Harbor.
So this was the Secretary for the Navy in the late Reagan era, and so he's getting on a bit now, but he's got some good points to make, very much like our own Brian Gerrish has found since retiring from the Navy, which is that with the generation handover, which is affecting the military and the civil service in many ways, the expertise is being lost. But people can freeze that later and read it. The points he's making are, we've had a string of accidents. Okay, some people think that there's Russian and Chinese ECMs involved in these, but even if you just leave it at the level of, a comedy of errors, well, not a comedy because people died and drowned in the ocean, but a series of errors may have caused this. Even if you keep it at that level, then the human reason for the errors, just staying within the US Navy's Pacific Fleet, is people being over-promoted, not enough of the senior guys, particularly the NCO level, which runs an Army, Navy and Air Force, and which is deliberately targeted, like the similar ranks in the police, the sergeants and inspectors. So there's some undermining going on. The most worrying thing is Mr. Lehman is warning of a Pearl Harbor, but the whole point about that is that the first time Pearl Harbor happened, it was allowed to happen. A lie-hop let it happen on purpose. I think everyone, all serious historians, accept that now. It was claimed by more and more over the decades, and it's now known pretty much for certain with declassified decrypts. And so the fear is that if this language is being used, and again with the project for a new American century also talking about new Pearl Harbors, then what we're looking at is perhaps, as we were talking about yesterday, Mike, in another context, a desire in Western elite circles to start World War III and get away with it.
Let's look at another direction that they're attacking this, because we highlighted this as it happened. This is the Joint Strategic Exercise Zapad 2017, and the hysteria, the absolute hysteria over this when it happened earlier this year. Russian exercise taking place mainly in Belarus. The NATO Review has published this article, Zapad 2017 and Euro-Atlantic Security, and they say since 2008, Russia has used its strategic exercises and large-scale SNAP exercises to hone its military capabilities, undermine regional stability and peace, and twice, first in Georgia and then in Ukraine, to mask impending aggression. Exercise Zapad 2017 was the latest iteration of such exercises. The main focus is the claim that Russia deliberately underestimates the number of troops taking part in exercises in order to avoid attracting foreign observers. That's the main claim that they're making in this. And they say that Russian troops remained on the Georgian border after exercise Kavkaz ended on the 2nd of August 2008, and a force estimated at approximately 40,000 troops started operations on Georgian territory on the 7th of August, halting under international pressure 5 days later on the outskirts of Tbilisi. Alex, is that a fair statement of what took place?
No, in a word. I was following those troop movements and they weren't there. I really don't know where they're getting that from. Are they suggesting that the Russians made the Ossetian War happen on purpose? Famously, President Putin was in Peking for the Olympics, and he had to come back in a hurry, and there's footage of him with genuine shock and rage on his face, putting his face up to the cameras, the official Russian presidency cameramen who were with him, and saying, stop, these women are too distraught at the loss of their menfolk. There's nothing faked about that. Everyone was taken by surprise, including arguably the Georgian defense minister, David Kezarashvili, who was out of the country. So that's completely pulled out of someone's wrong orifice, I'm afraid. That it's taken them 9 years to come up with this.
Absolutely. But it's much worse than it seems, because they're actually saying that this was premeditated, that Russia only held its exercise in that place so that it could then pop across the border and do what it did. It's incredible. They then go on to say, Exercise Zapad 2017 officially conducted on NATO's eastern borders in Russian Western Military District and on the territory of Belarus from the 14th to 20th of September was the latest iteration of the exercise series, thus linked to Europe's first war of the 21st century. And they're saying that that's the Georgian War. They link to a document on the Georgian War. Now, this table is what they use to represent their claim. And they're showing various Russian exercises, including the 3 Zapad exercises and the most recent one, Zapad 2017. And they're saying that the Russian Ministry of Defense announced 12,700 participating troops on Zapad 2017, but they are estimating that the true number of participating troops for Zapad 2017 was 60,000 to 70,000. Well, even that's significantly less than the 120,000 that they were getting all hysterical about at the time. But it is an incredible thing. They go on to say in this article, the strategic nature of Zapad was highlighted by a simulated defense of the Moscow region by S-400 air defense interceptors against a mass cruise missile attack. Dual-capable conventional and nuclear precision strike capability was also a major element of Zapad, including SS-21 Scarab and SS-26 Iskander missile unit activity, with live firing in other regions by Iskander units not stationed in the Western Military District. The Ministry of Defense also reported extensive exercise activity by chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear defense units, underscoring the Russian Armed Forces' ability to operate in a CBRN-contaminated environment. The exercise activities were conducted in two phases, a first defensive and counter-offensive phase, followed by a transition to a second offensive phase. NATO spokesperson Oana Lungescu consequently said that, quote, in effect, all these activities together constituted a single strategic exercise. Zapad was clearly a large-scale state-on-state conflict. And the article goes on to say the character, scale and intensity of Russian military exercise activities during September 2017 is consistent with the system of strategic operations that Russia would conduct in conflict with NATO, focusing on the Western strategic direction and supporting military activity nationwide in all strategic directions and potential global operations in an escalating conflict. The response by NATO collectively and allied nations individually was far from the hysteria of which Moscow accused them. And so it goes on. The hysteria in this article is fantastic. And they say, Alex, that the NATO declarations, this is how they end it, they say that the NATO declarations from both Wales and Warsaw were great examples of NATO's response to all this. But in fact, Alex, those NATO declarations from both Wales and Warsaw were hysterical. The Wales declaration, for example, mentions Russia 45 times. Russia's mentioned 59 times in the Warsaw Declaration, including in Clause 11, which says NATO has responded to this changed security environment by enhancing its deterrence and defence posture, including by a forward presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and by suspending all practical civilian and military cooperation between NATO and Russia, while remaining open to political dialogue with Russia. We reaffirm these decisions. So this continuing hysteria over this, plus the fact that they have suspended all practical civilian and military cooperation with Russia, this can really only end in one direction, surely.
A pre-planned outcome, I'm afraid, Mike. Deliberately, defence intelligence has been slashed in the English-speaking countries and France and so on, particularly in Britain. They were told actually they would have to shed as many men as they needed to vacate one of their buildings in Whitehall to be flogged off. That's how haphazard it was. And these men were bean counters who knew every last piece of equipment in foreign armies. And so now we have politicians who in many cases have never been east of Vienna, never held a rifle, trying to discern or pre-script before the military men get involved, trying to pre-script these communiques at NATO summits. But what you showed on screen makes it quite clear. There's a 4-year roulement in Russia of combined arms, large-scale exercises. The names of them, Zapad, Center, Vostok, Kavkaz, simply mean Western, Central, Eastern and Caucasus. And it's a 4-year plan, which only Russia needs because there's no other country geographically like Russia in the world. It's a 4-year way of making sure that they can't get invaded by Germany, can't get invaded by the Turks, can't get invaded by the US through Central Asia, and can't get invaded by the Chinese. They have nasty histories with all 4 elements coming to the fore, and with local allies, anti-Russian peoples being stoked up in all of those areas. There's no comparison between that and, for example, an island nation or a nation with effectively its own continent. That's the UK, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. How can we possibly compare? Even France, which is a continental nation but with friends on all sides. There's no way we can compare the way we do our military readiness with the way the Russians, as Peter Hitchens says, with these indefensible planes, particularly on the west and also towards China, and with repeated experiences of having world wars launched against them, that it only stands to reason that the Russians keep themselves in readiness.
Yeah, absolutely. First thing to mention, of course, is that this is the 6-month anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, and in order to commemorate that, there was a service taking place at 11 o'clock this morning in St Paul's Cathedral. They were expecting about 1,500 people to attend that, including representation from the government and the royal family. And it's designed, according to St Paul's website here, to remember those who died, to show solidarity with the bereaved and survivors, and to give thanks for everyone who assisted on the ground at the time of the tragedy. Well, I would just like to say that, of course, we would maintain or reiterate our solidarity with the bereaved and the survivors, and we will do everything that we can to help with that. Alex, have you any brief thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do feel guilty that we haven't been able to report more on Grenfell, but it's such a stew on the ground, and we don't want to be stoking any tensions, because there's already so much mutual suspicion among some of the survivors and their relatives, quite understandably. So we want to make sure that what we report is solid, and also that it has the support of the local community. But we certainly haven't forgotten about this. I noticed that Lady Leisha, a very big rapper, not my kind of music at all, but in her latest rap, Queen's Speech 7, she has this question: who stood up when Grenfell? And then she asks where Theresa May spent all the money that was raised for Grenfell. So that's become, at least in the black community, a nationwide international issue now.
Yes, absolutely. To end on this one, because the Secretary of State has appointed a new chair to Ofcom, Lord Terry Burns. Lord Burns is very pleased to have the opportunity to take this role, apparently. Well, this appointment has been made in accordance with the Cabinet Office's Governance Code of Public Appointments, so we can all rest assured that that's a good decision. Apparently, the chair of Ofcom is appointed by the Secretary of State. Remuneration for the role is £120,000 for up to 3 days a week, so that three days a week. So that might be half a day. It could be 2 days. We don't really know. The term of the appointment is 4 years. So who is Lord Burns? Well, he's got quite an interesting background. He was on the Lords Speakers Committee on the size of the House of Lords, so he's into constitutional reform. He's been on the Economic Affairs Committee. He's been on the Trade Union Political Funds and Political Party Funding Committee. He's been on the Economic Affairs Committee, the Financial Services and Markets Joint Committee, and he's been on the Monetary Policy Committee for the Bank of England. Professionally, well, he's most recently been chairman of Channel 4 Television. He's been chairman of Marks & Spencer's PLC. He's been a non-executive director for Banco Santander. He's been a chairman for Santander UK PLC. And he's been involved in a number of other companies, including Pearson Group, Pearson PLC. And he's also been chairman of the Freedom of Information Commission, a non-executive member of the Office for Budget Responsibility. He's been chairman of Structural Review of the Football Association. He's been an independent advisor to the Secretary of State for the BBC Charter Review. He's been a chairman of the National Lottery Commission. He's been a chairman of the Committee for the Inquiry into the Impact of Hunting with Dogs in England and Wales. He's been permanent secretary to HM Treasury. He's been a chief economic advisor to HM Treasury and head of the Government Economic Service. So he's done rather a lot. But I thought it was interesting that he was chairman of Santander PLC. And while he was chairman of Santander, he was happy to sign this document, which is the report, the Corporate Social Responsibility Report for 2010 for Santander. As we scan down through that, we discover that they are supporting education. Apparently, the new Santander Education Fund provided funding of over £1 million to projects addressing financial capability in the secondary and further education sectors through a series of new partnerships with lead national charities and third sector organisations. Santander were providing long-term support for financial education to help increase financial awareness and capability for young people and to fund materials for disadvantaged groups. And so that was £1 million pot. And well, look, one of the organisations being funded was our old friend Common Purpose, who were running front-runner courses specifically targeted at disabled students to help develop their leadership skills and equip them to be on UK public policy boards. It was a residential course, 400 young disabled people taking training in 2011. So, Alex, this is a great person to have in charge of Ofcom, in charge of regulating the press and the media in this country.
Clearly, he's come into it because of his abiding passion for communications and his specialism in the broadcasting industry, given the list you read out. But no, banks, and he is obviously a bank man, at least second-hand, they love education, re-education, and reframing, including communication, because that creates the tabula rasa, the blank slate of mankind, which the very tops of the banks want to have, without any sense of history or identity. And at the very top, this is why the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations has, according to two good sources, Dr. John Coleman and Daniel Estulin, been used by the Bank for International Settlements as its laboratory to come up with ways of erasing mankind's history and starting afresh. So that's the top level of this. Yep.
We said right at the beginning of the program that we would discuss Sky News, so we're going to end with this because this is all about Murdoch and Fox and the deal, because Disney has apparently closed in, according to Sky News, on the $60 billion Fox deal. So what's this about? Well, basically they're selling off 20th Century Fox Film Studio. They're also selling off US cable networks like FX, National Geographic Channel, as well as international pay television assets, including Star TV in India. But it also includes Fox's 39.1 stake in Sky PLC, the owner of Sky News. So, Alex, just to close the show, I just thought it was really appropriate that Sky News should be owned by Disney, because most of what they put out these days is no more than a fairy tale.
Well observed, Mike. And the ever-alert Martin Edwards has pointed out, meanwhile, that Pearson, our lead partners in the United Nations, Tell Everyone About the Global Goals campaign. And Pearson sit alongside the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in that work. If people haven't watched last Friday's broadcast, go back and find David Scott talking about his wife Leslie's article about the third sector. These guys, as Leslie warns, are in danger of being seen as the enemy rather than our servants.
Yes, absolutely. We'll just get straight on with Theresa May, of course, back from the European Council meeting. And apparently she has accepted plans that we will not be discussing trade initially in the next stage of Brexit talks. Instead, we're going to focus as a priority on the transition period. And Brian, I'm just going to ask you straight away how this is possible. So this is not a literal quote that I've got on screen at the moment. This is a summary of what she's saying, but for the next stage we'll be focusing on the transition agreement. My top priority is Britain's deep and special relationship with the European Union. But perhaps, because it goes completely over my head, but perhaps, Brian, you could explain to me how it's possible to transition something to something that you don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, Mike?
Right,
well, your suggestion was because she already knows where she's going. She knows what has already been agreed. So she knows it, the public don't, but she can concentrate on the transition. Or else this is pure obfuscation. This is about just making things more opaque, more complicated, and chewing up more time, so Brexit is delayed.
Absolutely. Well, these are the possibilities, and we have our views. But anyway, the main focus, as we mentioned yesterday, on the day's events was the EU military, which is shiny and new, and here they all are. This is the EU military. It's fantastic looking, isn't it?
I'd love to put them on the battlefield, actually. They can be in the trenches up front, all of them. I think it'd be really good.
Right, so there you go. That's what they look like. There are some uniforms in there, as well as the politicians that are going to be sending people to die. Let's have a look at what Ms. Mogherini, Federica Mogherini, the High Representative of the European Union, had to say yesterday about this. Now, we're going to discuss this as we go, because some of the things she said were pretty spectacular. Here we go.
No. First of all, let me say that today is an historic day, because exactly 10 years after the signing of the Lisbon Treaty, we turn into reality one of the provisions of the treaty. The Permanent Structured Cooperation was launched on Monday by the foreign ministers of 25 member states. So an historic decision that turns the European Union into a credible security provider globally.
Right. So the European Union, Brian, is now a global security provider.
Yeah, it's something.
Is this a commercial arrangement? They go to South Sudan or something, and they make some kind of commercial arrangement with the Sudanese people, and they say, we'll come in with our EU military and we'll provide you with security, in inverted commas, in return for contracts. Is that what that's about?
Well, it's global corporatist language on one hand, so perhaps they're using it because this is now showing the real power of the banks and the procurers of the defence military infrastructure, or else they have to use this kind of term because if they talk about the European defence system, they are talking about the unification plans, and they don't want the British public in particular to realise that that is exactly what's happening.
So let's continue.
We'll now have 17 concrete projects on which the 25 member states that have launched the permanent structural cooperation will start to work together with us, and the work will continue. I have already my team at work to launch further work on the European Union security and defence, not only the implementation of these 17 projects, but also we can work at the possibility to deploy one of our battle groups.
Right. So can I just get this correct? They are now looking for an opportunity to deploy one of their battle groups. They are actively seeking an opportunity. Are they going to create this opportunity? Is maybe UK aid is going to create this opportunity?
Well, remember that Theresa May was effectively talking about a new Operation Barbarossa against Russia, where she was talking about the importance of the grain and the oil. So maybe they're winding up somewhere in Eastern Europe to then have a go at the Russians. But they want to play with their new toy, obviously.
Clearly.
In one of the theatre crises that we have around the world, we can work at the establishment of a European facility for peace.
Right, now pay attention. A facility for peace, Brian, a facility for peace.
It's a battle group for peace.
Well, absolutely.
I'm going to suggest that in the next multi-annual financial framework, we will set up this facility to finance the level of ambition we have on security and defence, so that this Europe of defence and security is also financed at the adequate level. This is not going to be a militarization of the European Union budget, but it's going to be a way of being more flexible, more agile and more operational whenever.
So what do we say about that?
Well, it's double speak. Actually, it's a complete lie, because they are now setting up the financial arrangements to pay for unified EU military structure. She says, of course it isn't, but of course it is. So,
but it's finance for peace.
In the form of a battle group, yes.
It's needed, and we see that around the world there is a strong need for the European Union to be active as a point of reference, as a player, as others are taking different directions. And I will also set up now in the coming days a task force here in Brussels to coordinate the different strands of work on the European Union of Security and Defence. I have to say this is also the best way to honour the Lisbon Treaty that, as you know, created my role as the double hat, Vice President of the Commission, High Representative. It works, it has delivered, and now we have to continue coordinating all the different policies, Commission, Council, European Defence Agency, Member States.
Spectacular, isn't it? So
the self-praise was just wonderful there, drifted in. I've got two hats. I was given those two hats. I've done a brilliant job. Well done, me.
So, David, we've covered quite a lot there, but this is spectacular from Ms. Mogherini.
It certainly is. So it's very clear that what Jean-Claude Juncker, the EU president, called the sleeping beauty of the Lisbon Treaty is sleeping no more. It's very much alive. And as Ms. Mogherini said, it works. Yes.
Well, look, just before we move on from defence, I just want to draw people's attention to this, because apparently the RAF has a new squadron, Brian. This is fantastic. It's number 12 squadron. Well, this has been announced by Harriet Baldwin. Well, it follows Gavin Williamson's who's the Defence Secretary. It follows his trip to Doha last week, where he agreed a package of training and cooperation between the British and the Qatari Air Forces. And of course, he also sold a bunch of Typhoon aircraft. And so what they've agreed to do is to set up number 12 Squadron, and it will temporarily, they say, integrate Qatari personnel, including pilots and ground crew, based at RAF Collingsby in Lincolnshire. So, Brian, I don't know what thoughts you've got on that. Harriet Baldwin said, just by the way, that Qatar proudly becomes the 9th nation to buy the world's leading multi-role combat aircraft. The formation of a joint squadron means the RAF will take the lead in providing training and support to the Qatari Emirates.
So something's brewing in the Middle East, Mike, aren't they? We shouldn't forget, of course, the new Royal Navy base in Bahrain. That was talked about a while ago. It's now gone completely silent, but apparently we want assets in the region, a formation of this squadron. So we haven't got the forces ourselves, so we embed people in order to direct these so-called lesser nations. There's something very, very sinister, I think, forming.
Yes. One of the, I suppose, key areas that we've been researching and commenting on for a number of years now is that of behavioural change. And we've discussed behavioural change in economics. We've discussed behavioural change in politics with the Behavioural Insights team and the Cabinet Office behavioural change projects and so on, and Common Purpose over the years. But one area where we haven't looked particularly closely at behavioural change is healthcare. And so I'm glad to welcome Dr. Graham Downing to the programme. Hello, Graham. How's things going? And this is an area that you've been looking into now, and we're going to just run through a few pieces on this. It is something which seems to be at the heart of the political scene at the moment. But to see this moving into healthcare is not the best thing that we've seen, I think.
Yeah. Hi, Mike and Brian. This is that guy there. His name's Kendall Taylor, Nat Kendall Taylor, and he's the head guy of something called Frameworks. And what they do is effectively they analyze, for example, social media. They'll analyze people. They analyze how they think and how they express themselves, how they feel, and they do this for one purpose and one purpose only: is to work out what makes them tick and how to reverse engineer to get them to believe whatever message they've been paid to tell these people. So they're kind of hired guns in a way. And the reason why I highlighted that is I had an advanced copy. I did give you the slide. I'm not sure if you've got it there. Oh, you've got it on the screen, I think, which is lessons learned from diverse efforts to change social norms and opportunities and strategies to promote behavioural change in behavioural health. Now, they were looking at mental health a lot there as well. But this was presented at National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. So this is at the highest level. And they've got these guys in now saying, well, this is how we do it. This is how we look at people. And really, when you're on social media, what you don't realize is all your data is being analyzed by these people. And they do it for one purpose only, is how to suss out, to get you to believe what they want you to believe. And I think that's terrible. I mean, it's a simple thing for me to say really, but it is terrible. We don't want people doing this sort of stuff.
Right. So, Graham, you've highlighted a couple of quotes out of this. First of all, Mr. Kendall Taylor, then describes the research process carried out by the Frameworks Institute to discover the cultural models that shape people's thinking. He said that the objective was to uncover the cultural assumptions behind the patterned ways in which people answered open-ended questions.
Yeah, and he was presenting to these academies how they go about what they do, how they go about finding out how you think, how you feel, what cultural influences you've got, and then how they target their message to you to get you to buy into whatever they've been told to get you to buy into. And when we move on from this, and you start to get into the next publication and meetings at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, you see where they're going with this, because it starts to get into vaccines and what they call vaccine hesitancy.
So this one is building communication capacity to counter infectious disease threats.
This is Dina Maron, and I think she's one of the editors at Scientific American, which is a huge publication. She looks very young. They all look very young, these people. Maybe we're just getting older, I don't know. And she talks about social media, and they're talking about, it's a great thing. We can use it for great, but also we've got to watch it, and we've got to be very careful with it. And she was giving expert advice to health experts, and she said, look, in terms of practical advice for public health experts and responders, Maron recommended being vigilant online to see what information and misinformation are spreading, perhaps even making that task part of someone's job. And when you move on to the next slide, you're going to see that's already been done. It already is someone's job. And the lady you've got on there, if you might want to read something off that.
Right, it says Dr. Heidi J. Larson is an anthropologist and director of the Vaccine Confidence Project, professor of anthropology, risk and decision science, Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology, LSHTM, associate clinical professor, Department of Global Health, University of Washington, and the Chatham House Center on Global Health Security fellow. Dr. Larson previously headed global immunization communication at UNICEF, chaired Gavi's advocacy task force, and served on the WHO SAGE working group on vaccine hesitancy. The VCP is a WHO Centre of Excellence on addressing vaccine hesitancy. Dr. Larson's research focused on the analysis of social and political factors that can affect uptake of health interventions and influence policies. Of particular interest is on risk and rumour management from clinical trials to delivery and building public trust. She served on the FDA Medical Countermeasure Emergency Communications Expert Working Group and is a principal investigator of the EU-funded project on the development, acceptance and compliance of an Ebola vaccine trial in Sierra Leone.
I mean, there's a mouthful just in that lot. I mean, you've only got. I mean, look, you know, I stay to my field, but I'm reasonably informed enough to see things like Chatham House start coming up and other things. And you guys, I'm sure, could spin off quite a lot and talk about those places. But what this suggests to us is this woman is very, very deep into the systems that you guys and the systems of government and the deep systems of government and what you guys would call the deep state. And if you look at her bio there, it really exemplifies that perfectly. And what's incredible, did you know all these groups were going on? Did you know that the FDA had a medical countermeasure emergency communication expert working group? I mean, who'd have thought that we were such a threat, all these people here that chat and talk about vaccines, that they've got to have expert emergency communication groups to meet and discuss how they're going to tackle people that just query and just ask questions on social media about global health intervention. And just the word global, every time you hear that word global, 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 you know, you really, the hairs on the back of your neck should stand up, because these are people who really are just centralizing power. And really, when you look at the research, and as we progress on further, you'll see how disconnected these people actually are.
In this one, it says that she began a presentation by quoting Margaret Chan, director of the World Health Organization, who said the days when health officials could issue advice based on the very best medical and scientific data and expect populations to comply may be fading. She noticed that changing maybe in that quotation to are would reflect the reality of what she called the post-fact society. This is kind of the same narrative that we've had with the so-called post-truth society and fake news and so on. So there seems to be some overlap there. It goes on to say Larson's program, the Vaccine Confidence Project, acts as a surveillance system for public opinion on vaccines. The vaccine issue she worries about the most relates to how the world behaved in regard to the H1N1 outbreak and what she called the horrible worldwide non-compliance around the vaccine. There's a quote here. She said, it is not just the end users. We have people in the middle, the gatekeepers, the health professionals and the gatekeepers outside of our health community that we need to put under our lens. That sounds pretty
Orwellian, I think.
Yeah, indeed.
There's the reason why. Okay, there's two people. There's a one person mentioned there, Chan. Okay, kind of head of the World Health Organization, and I did send you the last quote, which hopefully will get us to mention when you see just where this woman's coming from. Put her to the side for the second. What they're suggesting is the assumption has been made by these people that everything that has been said, everything's been done, the research is all there, and you can't question anything. Anything that questions is post-fact. There is absolutely no science to back that up. In fact, the opposite. The minute you stop talking about science is the minute it becomes unscientific. We then start to become fake science if we don't challenge it. And it's the same within politics. And what she's saying is, look, they're being challenged now by not just people outside of the medical community, but people in the medical community. And she said, we've now got to put those under our lens. And what they're doing is they're monitoring all of us. It's outrageous. Now, if you look at that quote in big letters on the, I'll just very quickly before you go on to the next slide, Mike. She said, look, she noted that this non-compliance was not just the US or European phenomenon, it's worldwide. And the Indian Ministry of Health called her up and said, why are 85% of our nurses and trained healthcare professionals in one of India's states refusing the vaccine? And because people are starting to think and they're starting to realize that maybe not all is what it says on the tin with these things.
So we've got The Guardian here, not quite sure when this is from 2009. So the headline is Swine Flu, a panic stoked in order to posture and spend. It's by Simon Jenkins. And you've got a quote here. It says, we have gone demented. 2 Britons are or were not very ill from flu. This could really explode, intones a reporter for BBC News. London warned, it's here, cries the Evening Standard. Fear is said to be spreading like a Mexican wave. It could affect 750,000 Britons. It could cost $3 trillion. The danger, according to the radio, is that workers who were not ill will be worried, perhaps by the reporter, and fail to turn up at power stations and hospitals. Appropriately panicked, on Monday, ministers plunged into their Cobra bunker beneath Whitehall to prepare for the worst. Had Tony Blair been about, there would have been germ warfare suits. British government is barking mad.
Well, I mean, how many times have we seen this? With the SARS, with the bird flu, with this, swine flu, with Ebola. He's quite right. And, I've given you some examples there of what maybe Dr. Larson would like to look at, because bearing in mind, she's in charge of all this, of monitoring us all and getting us to, with all these other experts like Nat Kendall-Taylor, to try and find out how they can make us take this stuff and change the way we think. And publishing data that is which has been looked at the highest levels. So these people are influencing policy and influencing what happens to us. And the reason I've picked this example, what she said, is because she's talking about swine flu. She's so upset that we didn't get everyone to take the swine flu thing. Now we're going to pull that apart through these next slides. And that's an introduction first to say, well, there may be a lot more what was going on with this swine flu than what we originally thought. And if you show Sharon, I think you've got it up on screen, which is Cheryl Atkinson. She was an award-winning reporter, and I think she worked for CBS News, and she broke a story on this. And she went through and she looked at it. She first of all went to try and find out data on who's actually got swine flu. And she went to the officials and they didn't give her the information. So she went to each individual state in America, or quite a few of them, and she got individual data. And the bottom left kind of pie charts there, a little flow diagram of pie charts, tells you that hardly anyone had flu, let alone had swine flu. All these people they were diagnosing. I mean, in one state, Florida, only 17% of who they stated had swine flu only had it. In another state, it was 2%. Another one, it was only 1%. In another one, only 2%. So what they did was they grossly inflated these figures. Whether they did it deliberately or not, or just through panic or whatever, they grossly inflated these figures. And you see this when they have these kind of panics over, pandemics. Now that's bad enough. Now they should have then said, right, let's have a halt to this, because there's obviously not this big thing going on that we think's going on. But what they did was they then stopped reporting the figures. They made a conscious decision. CDC, Centers for Disease Control, said stop reporting the figures, because they knew if you reported the figures, the game would be up. Obviously, they were not looking out based on these data. They were not looking out for us. They were looking out for a different interest, because if not, then why did they stop reporting the data when it was showing that no one really had swine flu?
So we've got a couple of other examples. One from the Mail here: the false pandemic, drugs firms cashed in on scare over swine flu, claims Euro Health chief. From Boston.com, 2 medical reports accuse WHO, the WHO, of exaggerating H1N1 threat. And you're featuring a guy called Wolfgang Wodarg here.
Yeah, and he's part of the whole EU thing. I mean, like the Council of Europe. I mean, this guy was pretty high up. He's a medical physician. I mean, I put his credentials on there, and he rung the alarm bells. And he said the WHO, this is his direct quote from him, in collaboration with big pharmaceutical companies and their scientists redefined pandemics, and they lowered the alarm threshold. So they reset the alarm so that it would be triggered quicker once you started to raise concern over certain infections. Okay, and so they did that first, and then those new standards forced politicians, in order to go and buy the drugs that the vaccines, same difference, that these drug companies were selling. And he said, never before the search for traces of a virus was carried out so broadly and intensively. Besides, many cases of death that happened just to coincide with a seropositive H1N1 lab findings were simply attributed to the swine flu and used to foster fear. He states directly it was a con. Yeah. It was a total con.
Okay, look, we'll move through to this one, which is deaths from pneumonia influenza in 122 cities. And the point you're making here is that there were more deaths in the 3 years prior to 2009.
There was, absolutely. Swine flu, no one wants to die from anything, for God's sake, but the deaths during the so-called swine flu pandemic were the least they had in years. The prior 3 years were worse. So they lowered the threshold, the alarm threshold. Certain individuals went and warned that we've got a problem. They almost forced these governments into buying this stuff and the vaccines. And then and what we're not mentioning here, Mike, is I did give you a paper, a reference on what the swine flu has done. They did that. They calculated data, and Dr. Goldberg published a paper and said that more deaths, more spontaneous abortions happened, more stillbirths happened during the time when people had that vaccine, plus a normal flu vaccine. And also, hundreds, if not thousands of people were paralyzed due to something called Guillain-Barré syndrome. So there's a lot of damage that was caused by this. And the British Medical Journal published a whole letter saying that WHO had lost credibility. But you know what? It was a great success because the drug companies made between 7 and 10 billion I think it was dollars out of it. Yeah. And it's an absolute disgrace. And the reason I'm pointing this out is the head person, Dr. Larson, who is so worried about no one took this vaccine in 2017, all these years later, uses that as an example of why they need to push ahead and surveil us and do all this sort of stuff. It's an outrage.
Yeah, so the two people you're highlighting here are not Kendall Taylor, but Dr. Heidi Larson. And is this the quote that you wanted to highlight here? The days when health officials could issue advice based on the very best medical and scientific data and expect population to comply are fading. And then you finish off by saying the vaccine issue she worries about the most relates to how the world behaved with regard to H1N1 and what she called the horrible worldwide non-compliance around the vaccine. So they've got to change our behaviour.
Exactly, but she's completely she's unhinged. Well, I'm not going to say she's unhinged from the data. Even the leading medical journals and everyone else seems to know that was a big con to sell. And there's a much darker side to that we don't have time to get into, but maybe we'll do something on that at some time in the future. This is the woman who's in charge. This is the woman who's surveilling you or what you're writing on social media, and they're working out how they can get you to believe what they want to believe. She's the trusted person at the helm, and yet she doesn't even seem to understand that what her perfect example she's using to drive this forward was a complete con.
Yeah. Let's move to the BBC. And David, Belfast Telegraph here is reporting that the BBC has been using the Regulatory Powers Act, the terrorism laws, to catch people who are not paying their TV licence.
The BBC is using anti-terror spy laws, writes the Belfast Telegraph, to trap licence fee dodgers in Northern Ireland. And it transpires not just Northern Ireland. Just one little comment from that article, which was particularly sinister. A TV licensing spokesperson said the average evasion rate remains at a low of 5 to 6%, meaning 94 to 95% of homes are correctly licensed. So in their view, there are two options. You are correctly licensed or you are evading the license. There doesn't seem to be any third option where you actually don't have a TV. There you go. Now, this has been generated through a firm called Capita. Capita have the contract, which they won in 2011. It's an 8-year contract, goes up to 2019, to collect the BBC's licence fee, all 3.7 billion of it from 96% of UK households every year. and the BBC seem extremely happy at their efficiency. Now, what's the reason I'm raising this is that it transpires that in Scotland as well, RIPSA, the Regulation of Investigatory Power of Scotland Act, is being used to spy on Scottish people in order to find out if they are evading the licence fee. Now, the specifics for this are quite interesting because a person who doesn't have a television licence and was having a lot of hassle from Capita contacted their internet service provider and put in a Freedom of Information request to see if there'd been any contact. And the response made it clear that not only had there been contact, but Capita had applied under RIPSA to receive their confidential information and had been provided with everything, full browsing history, emails, the lot. Now, this means that this has gone through the courts in Scotland. A sheriff must have signed off on this and issued the warrant. All of this was done in secret. We don't know how much of this is happening. And then that means that this person's internet service provider provided his browsing history, and Capita are presumably scanning this to find out if he's been using BBC iPlayer or some other service which would allow them to fine him.
Sorry, David. This fits in very nicely with what we've been reporting during the week with private security firm, private investigative firms putting people in amongst campaign groups and trying to gather information. But I wasn't aware that the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, whether it be in Scotland or the rest of the UK, was for the use of commercial organisations. I thought it was for the use of the security services and the police. This is something I think that as a general observation, people probably aren't aware of.
Well, when it was sold to us, it was sold as necessary protection against terror, against the nasty terrorists, as so many of these things are. But of course, it grows and grows, and we're seeing it used by local authorities for perhaps tax evasion or something like this, and by a whole host here of private companies looking to gather in information. So yes, it's grown beyond its original advertised purpose very greatly.
And David, last week's coverage of the issues over the Shatter Boys, well, there was quite a response to it.
There was quite an angry response on social media. There was a lot of support on social media as well for what we're saying, which I'll come to if I may. So the way we're driving with this, there's been a response from the head of Shatter Boys, Daniel Wilson-Croft, via a blog called the Outlaw Blog, and I've got a couple of extracts just to comment on here. He says that Companies House had been contacted about this and said it was a type, and said that the name, whether his name is Wilson-Croft or Wilson-Home, and said it was typed incorrectly. The necessary forms have been submitted to remedy this error. So that's what he said publicly. A couple of questions about that. How would Companies House know whether the typing was correct or incorrect? And I spoke to Companies House this morning, and they had no record of anything being supplied to change the name. They said, quote, nothing has been received. So that doesn't seem to be entirely consistent. Mr. Wilson-Croft also said, I personally have high-level security clearance through the Home Office, and my name is Daniel Mark Wilson-Croft. Now, this refers presumably to the fact he's on the government inquiry into child sexual abuse in the panel of victims and survivors who are advising them. And this is something that we see in Scotland as well, and it's very strange because the people who are invited onto these government inquiries are often individuals who run very small organisations or essentially personal organisations. A lot of them are run, in Scotland at any rate, in quite a chaotic fashion. Whereas large, well-organised charities with a long track record of looking after child sexual abuse victims are excluded from core participation status or being in full involvement with the government investigation. And it's very strange as to why the government is choosing certain people and not certain others. And that concerns me quite a bit. Now, he also said, quote, Shatter Boys does not even have a bank account because one of the directors had bad credit with the bank we approached to open an account. We have received numerous donations, which has helped us travel and see clients up and down the country and run numerous events, end quote. Now, this also throws up some questions. It's unusual, very unusual, but not unknown for a limited company not to have a bank account. But that presumably means that the banking facilities have been run through the director's personal bank accounts. So that does raise some questions. Now, how much money is actually going through this? Mr. Wollstonecraft says that he's essentially subsidising this organisation, making nothing from it. Are there formal accounts? Can this actually be substantiated? There obviously, it gets very complicated with the tax authorities get involved in this sort of thing, because unless there's proper accounts, these things would be viewed as a director's loan, and it gets very complicated indeed. And I'll close on this one. He said the Companies House registration was pointless and means little, quoting Daniel Wollstonecraft again. It means little as it has no impact on how we work. It seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's caused more trouble than it's worth. And this is the reason it's getting dissolved, because a letter has been sent to confirm, because no letter has been sent to confirm that we want to stay open. So the organisation has been wound down after a year, no accounts ever produced. This is not the sort of organisation that you would normally expect to be chosen by the government to represent victims and survivors at the official inquiry. And it's understandable given maybe where the Shatter Boys came from, but it seems a strange place that they've been put at the very sort of head of the government inquiry, the very head of the victims and survivors representation on that inquiry. Now, speaking to some of the people in Manchester who were part of Shatter Boys, they made it clear that what this organisation started off was a group of regular men who had been abused and were in pain and were meeting to help one another. And that's something we can all applaud. It seems to have changed, and there are questions when it becomes a limited company, when it starts raising money. Things have to be done correctly. And this is why we're asking questions, in order to promote that. Now, I'd like to finish here. I've got a quote from Robert Greene, because I've been discussing what's been happening with people in this movement to defend child sexual abuse victims and survivors. And Robert Greene's comment, he said, absolute commitment is required, and it's vital to signal to the corrupt authorities that they are not feared. We believe in truth, compassion, justice and clarity. Our opponents, predominantly bullies and cowards, choose to live under stones. Transparency is our greatest weapon and our opponent's greatest weakness. It is the one that is most likely to take the people to victory. And I thought that was excellent. And that's why we're calling on transparency. And that's why we're saying that all the organisations involved in the fight against child sexual abuse have to be completely upfront, completely clear on their dealings, and scrupulously honest, because anything less will be exploited by those who wish to cover this up and keep everything in the dark and maintain the situation, which, let's not forget, has been industrial scale child sexual abuse endorsed and covered up by the authorities in this country for years.
Yeah. Any thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to get to the bottom of it. Perhaps we can say quite strongly that we do appreciate a number of people have got concerns that UK Column has asked questions. I think I'm right in saying we have given the opportunity for the gentleman to actually come on and speak live on UK Column, but that offer wasn't taken up. So at the moment, there are some grey areas, and we think it's right to ask questions.
Final comment, Dimit?
I would just like to say I raised last week whether it was the same Daniel Wollstonecraft that had been involved in the fraud, and pointed out that we didn't know this. I raised this because it had been circulating on social media, and I thought it was important to point out that there was no link that was established between this man and the person who had committed the fraud. Mr. Wollstonecraft has made it very clear that it's not him. He's stated that categorically, and I think it'd be fair to him to point that out today.
Okay, thank you for that. Brian, the Russians.
Yes, the nasty Russians are at it again, and I just had to pick up on this one. Here's the front page from the illustrious BBC News website. This is the article that had caught my attention here. It says, Russia, a new risk to undersea cables. Chief of Defence Staff Sir Stuart Peach warns disruption to undersea cables could be catastrophic. The images change on this little one, and this is the cables. You might not be able to see it as it's quite small, but those are the cables. They do change to a nasty Russian submarine just to ram things home. Well, I dug into this story and I found it fascinating, because here's the BBC in the main article reporting the Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Peach, saying that Russia was a risk to undersea cables, and he was giving a warning on this. This is grossly misleading stuff. I think it's significant he's talking at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. I'm sure if we had David Ellis with us today, he would say, well, remember to put the EU in front of that, because it's really UC. This is an EU biased institution. But let's see how the spin is conducted. So the headline and image suggests to the reader that it is the British military warning of cuts to undersea cable, or an attack on undersea cables. And this is reinforced by the opening text. So here we are. It says the UK's most senior military officers warned of a new threat posed by Russia to communications and internet cables that run under the sea. And it goes on with this statement. Air Chief Marshal Sir Stuart Peach, the Chief of the Defence Staff, said Britain and NATO needed to prioritise protecting the lines of communication. So the whole thing hinges on, this is new, apparently, Mike. This is a new threat, we are to believe. Those nasty Russians are doing something they've never done before. Well, we get into the article a bit more, and what do we see here? Well, he said it would be catastrophic. It would be catastrophic, a catastrophic hit on the economy if the cables were cut or disrupted. The BBC then gets the hit in. Could Russian submarines cut off the internet? That's there in the story. But where's this story really come from? Well, it's actually really come from the Policy Exchange think tank. And this is where we are now starting to see media spin, which is really fascinating. So Policy Exchange, UK think tank, we're an educational charity whose mission is to develop and promote new policy ideas that deliver better public services. So we've now got a charity advising us on defence, but is it really Policy Exchange that's advising? Because here's the document that it's all based on: undersea cables, indispensable, insecure. It's got a foreword by Admiral James Styridis, if I pronounce that correctly, United States Navy retired, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So it appears to be military, but if we get into it, it's not, because it's been put together by an MP called Rishi Sunak MP. Let's have a look at him. Well, if you go to his website, he's into lovely little communities up north, farming, sheep.
Rural affairs.
Rural affairs.
Because you got lots of communications cables running across the fields.
Well, this is the fascinating thing. I called his office this morning to ask if he'd got any experience whatsoever, personal experience in undersea cables or indeed undersea warfare. I wasn't able to get a response, but it was indicated to me that he really didn't. I've also spoken to Policy Exchange this morning and asked the same question. They more or less admitted that he didn't have any experience, but he did write this paper, apparently. Right. He dropped the sheep and he set to, and he started to write the paper. And at the end of the paper, it gives itself credit, because Admiral James Styridis, US Navy retired, says Policy Exchange's excellent report shines a fresh light on a growing threat. But the report itself admits that it loosely hangs off the Admiral's work in the first place. So we've got a nice circuitous tale here. Then we've got General Lord Nicholas Horton saying a very compelling summary of genuine strategic vulnerability. And we've even got Robert Hannigan, former Prime Minister Security Advisor and former Director of GCHQ, saying, well, it's good that Policy Exchanges pointed all this out to us. So they didn't know. We are to believe that senior military people and GCHQ had no idea that there was a threat to undersea cables.
Right.
So let's see the man in action. Here he is, Sir Stuart Peach. I've said he's delivering what I would regard as a lemon speech. He says, in response to the threat posed by the modernisation of the Russian Navy, both nuclear and conventional submarines and ships, we, along with our Atlantic allies, have prioritised missions and tasks to protect the sea lines of communication. And I've added to that, we've done this by scrapping 3 perfectly good anti-submarine aircraft carriers, scrapping the entire Nimrod maritime patrol fleet without replacement. We've wrecked the nuclear submarine fleet, we've wrecked the surface ships, and we've got cuts to the Army and RAF. The big lie with this, Mike, is of course this is not a new threat. This is a threat that has existed since the first cable was laid down in 1858. But if we go back to the Cold War, this was always a risk that these cables could be attacked and you needed the protection. But in the policy exchange report, it does not mention at all that, of course, the government has cut the very forces necessary to protect it. So this is not a new Russian threat. This is a threat which has now come to the fore because of government cuts, but policy exchange didn't want to deal with that aspect. So who wrote the article? Did the MP do it on his own? I don't think so, but we're waiting to find out. But what is the spin on this article? It's those nasty Russians.
So we'll end with an email.
I think we should.
So this is an email. Is this an email you have sent to?
Well, this is the email that I've actually sent through to the MP himself. I said, dear Mr. Sunak, I've been alerted to the BBC report on the policy exchange report undersea cables. Can you please direct me to your personal experience in undersea cables and undersea warfare upon which you rely on making this most interesting report? And I also say to him, you don't mention the effects of cuts that your government have made, which have created this problem.
So he is a Conservative MP?
Oh, of course. And just in case there's any doubt, Policy Exchange says it's a charity, but of course Francis Maud MP was one of the people behind the setting up of this independent, non-political charity.
So it's an independent, non-political Conservative charity?
Sort of, yes, Mike.
Yes,
But
right.
we're waiting for a formal reply from Policy Exchange as to why they left out defence cuts, and we will report accordingly if and when we receive any reply.
We should leave it there.
I think we should.